Welcome to Gripping Tales. Are you ready for today's video? It starts now.
Today's story begins like this. A wealthy industrialist lies dying in his Manhattan mansion. The year is 1897. His followers gather around the bed, not with prayers or tears, but with something else entirely. Chanting, willing, commanding his body to reject death itself. And here's the thing that makes your skin crawl. They actually believed it would work. Welcome to the story of the Harmonian Brotherhood, a 19th century cult that didn't just fear death, they declared war on it. They believed they'd discovered the secret to physical immortality, and what they did in pursuit of that impossible dream. Well, it left bodies in its wake. This is the true story of Thomas Lake Harris, his kingdom of the undying, and the horror that unfolded when ordinary people convinced themselves that death was optional. Thomas Lake Harris didn't start as a cult leader. That's never how these stories begin, is it? Born in 1823 in England, Harris arrived in America as a child with nothing but potential and a mind that couldn't sit still. He tried on religions like Coates, Baptist, Universalist, Spiritualist, never quite finding one that fit. By his 20s, he discovered he had a gift, not for faith exactly, for performance. Harris could preach. God, could he preach? His sermons didn't just move people, they transported them. He'd close his eyes, sway slightly, and words would pour out in torrents. He called it divine inspiration. His followers called it proof of his connection to the heavens. Modern psychologists might call it something else entirely. But here's where it gets strange. In the 1850s, Harris began claiming something new. He said he'd made contact with celestial beings, angels from higher planes of existence, who'd chosen him as their messenger. These weren't your grandmother's angels. These were beings of pure energy, Harris explained, who'd evolved beyond the crude prison of mortal flesh. And they'd shared a secret with him, the most important secret in human history. Death wasn't real. It was an illusion, a mistake, a prison humanity had locked itself into through ignorance and sin. The angels had shown Harris the way out. The theology Harris constructed was intricate, almost beautiful in its complexity. And that's what made it so dangerous. He taught that every human possessed a divine counterpart, a celestial twin, existing in the spiritual realm. Through proper breathing, meditation, and absolute purity of thought and deed, a person could unite with this counterpart. This union, Harris promised, would fundamentally transform the physical body. It would purify the blood, restructure the organs, and ultimately render the person immune to decay, disease, and death. Immortality, right here on Earth. No dying required. Harris called this state the use. Those who achieved it would become the vanguard of a new humanity. Perfected beings who would inherit the earth after the old, dying order collapsed. Now you might think people would laugh this off, but you'd be wrong. Because Harris understood something crucial about human nature. We're all terrified of dying, every single one of us. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, with hundreds of thousands dead and the country drowning in grief, a man promising victory over death itself, people wanted to believe. Wealthy people too, educated people. In 1861, Harris founded Doctrine, a commune in upstate New York that would become the headquarters of his Harmonian Brotherhood. Here, he attracted businessmen, artists, minor aristocrats. These weren't uneducated peasants. They were people who should have known better. But grief and fear make us all vulnerable to impossible promises. Brockton was beautiful, by all accounts. Rolling hills, vineyards, craftsman workshops. From the outside, it looked like a utopian experiment, one of dozens that dotted America in that era of social reformation. But inside, it was a prison with invisible bars. Harris controlled everything. Every aspect of daily life was regulated according to his divine revelations. Members rose at dawn for breathing exercises, Harris's special technique that supposedly opened the channels to their celestial counterparts. They worked the fields and workshops, but the fruits of their labor went to the Brotherhood. To Harris, he separated families, husbands from wives, parents from children. Earthly attachments, Harris explained, pollute the divine breath. Only through total surrender of worldly bonds could one achieve the use. And the money? It flowed like water. New recruits were required to sign over their assets to the Brotherhood. Everything. Homes, inheritances, bank accounts. Harris claimed that attachment to wealth was another barrier to immortality.
The irony, of course, is that all this donated wealth made Harris himself very comfortable indeed.
But here's what really happened inside those walls. The thing that survivors would later describe in testimony that still makes your blood run cold. Harris was selecting the worthy and eliminating the weak. It started with Jane Waring, a devoted follower in her 40s who'd given everything to the Brotherhood. Her family's fortune, her children, years of her life. Jane fell ill in 1864. Nothing dramatic, a fever, some weakness, normal stuff that normally passes. But Harris saw an opportunity. He declared that Jane's illness was a test. Her body was attempting to shed its mortal limitations, to transcend into the use. The angels themselves were performing surgery on her soul, he said. All she had to do was fast, stop eating entirely, let the divine energies purify her system, trust in the process.
Jane trusted. Of course she did. She'd trusted Harris with everything else.
She lasted 11 days without food. Near the end, other members later testified, she was delirious, begging for bread, for water, for anything. Harris stood firm. He told her followers that giving in to her cries would doom her soul, would prove their own lack of faith. Jane Waring died on October 3, 1864. Her body, already emaciated from months of purification rituals, simply gave out.
Harris called it a triumph. He told the assembled Brotherhood that Jane had graduated to a higher plane. Her spirit, he said, was now united with the celestial realm, watching over them all. He forbade anyone from reporting her death to outside authorities. She was buried quietly in the commune's grounds, with no official record, no death certificate. As far as the outside world knew, Jane Waring simply disappeared into the Brotherhood. She wasn't the last.
The breath of life exercises became increasingly extreme. Harris taught that by hyperventilating in specific patterns, members could force their bodies into alignment with celestial frequencies.
Sessions lasted hours.
People would gasp and pant until they collapsed, which Harris interpreted as successful communion with their divine counterparts. But hyperventilation does something very real and very dangerous to the human body. It disrupts the blood's pH balance, causes muscle spasms, can trigger seizures. In extreme cases, it can stop the heart.
At least 3 members died during these sessions between 1865 and 1867. Harris explained each death the same way. They'd achieved the use. They'd transcended. Their bodies had become so purified that they'd literally dissolved back into divine energy. The bodies, again, were buried on commune grounds. No investigations. No questions asked. You have to understand the psychological mechanism at work here. When you've given everything, your money, your family, your identity, to a belief system, admitting you were wrong becomes impossible. It would mean confronting a loss so total that it would shatter you. So instead, the remaining members doubled down. They convinced themselves that the deaths were proof of the doctrine's power. They watched people suffocate during breathing exercises and called it ascension. This is how cults survive exposure. Not through deception, but through the human mind's desperate need to make meaning from sacrifice.
By 1867, families of Brotherhood members were getting suspicious. Letters stopped coming. Requests for visits were denied. Some people who'd gone into Brockton hadn't been seen in years.
One family hired investigators. What they found started to leak into newspapers. Stories of financial exploitation, of bizarre rituals, of members who'd vanished without trace. The New York press, never shy about a scandal, began running exposés. But here's the frustrating thing. Harris was technically breaking very few laws. The members had joined voluntarily. They'd signed their money over of their own free will. Even the deaths could be explained away as tragic accidents. People who died during what were, on paper, just meditation exercises.
This was decades before modern cult awareness, before psychiatry understood coercive control. The legal system had no framework for prosecuting someone for psychological manipulation. Harris was untouchable. And he knew it. So he did what any good cult leader does when the walls start closing in. He moved. In 1875, Harris relocated the core of his operation to Fountain Grove in California. A fresh start, far from prying New York eyes, in the golden hills of Sonoma County. And the deaths? They continued. Fountain Grove was even more isolated than Brockton. Harris ruled it as an absolute monarch. His word, literally divine law. The commune grew grapes, made wine,
built an empire of earthly wealth while Harris continued promising his followers something beyond earthly concerns. But he was aging. The irony must have been delicious to observers. The man who promised immortality was growing old. His hair grayed. His body weakened. Death, that thing he'd spent decades declaring powerless, was coming for him too. Former members began speaking out more boldly. Lawsuits were filed. By the 1890s, Harris's reputation was in tatters, his brotherhood shrinking. And then, in March 1906, Thomas Lake Harris did the one thing he promised his followers they'd never have to do. He died. No transcendence, no transformation into pure celestial energy. Just death, ordinary and final, in his bed at Fountain Grove. He was 83 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered. The brotherhood dissolved within a year, the remaining members drifting away, never speaking publicly about what they'd witnessed and endured. Here's what haunts me about the Harmonian Brotherhood. The bodies were never exhumed. Those people who died during fasts, during breathing exercises, during the pursuit of an impossible promise, they're still there, under the grounds of what was once Brockton, under the hills of Fountain Grove. No markers, no records, just forgotten casualties of a war against death that death ultimately won, as it always does. Thomas Lake Harris understood something that every cult leader understands. Humans will do almost anything to escape mortality. We'll give our money, sacrifice our relationships, even watch people die and call it something else. Anything to believe that we might be the exception to the oldest rule in existence. The Harmonian Brotherhood failed in their goal. Death remained undefeated, but in trying to erase it, they created something arguably worse. Deaths that were invisible, unacknowledged, unmourned. People who vanished into the machinery of belief and were never counted. The 19th century was full of spiritual experiments, communes, and charismatic leaders promising transcendence. Most faded into history as curious footnotes, but the Harmonian Brotherhood left something darker behind, a reminder that the most dangerous promises are the ones we desperately want to believe. Death, after all, isn't the enemy. Denying death, denying reality itself, that's where the real horror lives. And somewhere, under Sonoma County's beautiful hills, the forgotten dead of Fountain Grove could tell you that, if only we'd listened before it was too late.
Thanks for watching. Every ending hides the beginning of another tale, and ours is already on its way. Stay tuned, you'll find the next chapter right here, and soon.